Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Our live thing in 3, 2.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 26th week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. For a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was no platformed there. No platforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for more than half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's July 1st, in a week in which Britain voted to leave the European Union, a Brexit, British exit from the EU. The vote to leave was a defeat of an attempt to rule 500 million people with what amounted to a capitalist dictatorship of the EU Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. It was anti-union and anti-working class, as the Greek experience recently demonstrated. The Brexit vote was a victory for democracy and equality in Europe, and a rare blow struck by ordinary people without any very strong leadership against the very powerful global forces of international supranational capitalism against all the odds. The vote in Britain to leave the EU is a matter of class politics, but since the position of the U.S. government and media is that class politics don't exist, the vote has to be turned into a matter of identity politics, a result of British racism versus immigrants. The now standard move from class politics to identity politics, on the soi-disant left as well as on the right, is affirmed. The neoliberal Labour Party took the occasion of the Leave vote to stage a coup against its Social Democrat leader, Jeremy Corbyn, a coup similar in some ways to that against President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. Once again, we have an illustration of how liberal and left are not gradations of one another, but actively opposed. Corbyn is on the left, as are the people who elected him, and what we would call liberals in the Labour Party, Blairites, are trying to bring him down, not, as they say, because he might lose the next UK election, but because he might win it, giving the UK a socialist government for the first time since they defeated Winston Churchill, a racist warmonger, and established a socialist government even right after World War II. The left should properly oppose the European Union and therefore support Brexit for the same reason it opposes the trade pacts, TPP and TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. They are anti-democratic, neoliberal institutions. The following remark is from a fellow called Richard Tuck, who's an Englishman but writing in America. He says, the British left risks throwing away the one institution which it has historically been able to use effectively, the democratic state, in favor of a constitutional order tailor-made for the interests of global capitalism and managerial politics, that is, the EU. The early members of the Labour Party in England, who were more Marxist than their successors cared to admit, understood this and believed that a properly organized working class using representation in the House of Commons as its vehicle could institute radical economic and social change. And compared with the life of the working class of the 19th century, working class life after the growth of labor vindicated their confidence. Indeed, the greatest achievement of the Labour Party, the creation of the National Health Service, right after World War II, would have been impossible in a country with strong constitutional constraints on the legislature, since it required the large-scale expropriation of private property in the shape of the old endowed hospitals. That's a major reason why so few countries have adopted the NHS model and why the neoliberals are trying to destroy it right now. In most of them, it would have been illegal, just as similar proposals would be illegal in the EU today. In the 1980s, however, demoralized labor politicians began to seek the shelter of continental-style constitutional structures. The most important of these was the EU, the European Union, which functions as a set of constraints on the internal politics of its member states, exactly as did the bourgeois constitutions of the mid-19th century. It's important to see that popular forces behind the Leave vote in the UK are quite similar to those behind the Sanders and Trump campaigns in the U.S. And the neoliberal, neocon political establishment, Republican and Democrat alike, is doing all it can by foul means and fair to stop that popular Democratic uprising. In this situation, here's the outline of the speech Bernie Sanders should give at the Democratic convention. There are 3 points. 1. Hillary Clinton represents the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that I, Bernie Sanders, have attacked throughout the campaign, and conversely, I cannot support these policies or her candidacy. 2. I urge those who supported me to oppose her nomination in this convention, and in the event that she is nominated, to defeat her candidacy in the general election. 3. To that end, I am seeking the most effective form of opposition, whether via a third party such as the Greens, or by means of coming to an agreement with the Trump campaign, which has declared its opposition to neoliberalism and neoconservatism, to the pro-war and pro-trade pact policies of the Clinton campaign. Close quote. Trump broke with the neocons by rejecting the Obama administration's wars in the Mideast and its provocations of Russia. The neocons immediately deserted the Republican Party and scurried to the pro-war Clinton campaign. Trump is now breaking with the neoliberals, who are also abandoning the Republicans for the pro-Wall Street, pro-trade pact Democrats. The rift deepened Thursday, writes the Washington Post, when Trump called out the U.S. Chamber of Commerce by name for the second straight day and pilloried the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 2 landmark trade agreements broadly supported by the GOP. Close quote. So you're watching News from Neptune, a trumping Brexit and bringing it all back home edition. And we'll start with David Green.
Thanks. I'm going to really pretty seamlessly continue from some of the themes that you've been talking about, Carl, although in the more direct context of the U.S. Presidential race. I think there's two informative books. I'm not going to speak to the fundamental sort of anti-neoliberal, pro-leftist economic issues that I often do. I'm going to delve in more to the cultural, racial issues and how we sort those things out, which tend to be foregrounded in these campaigns. The word neoliberalism isn't used by anyone in these. It isn't used by Bernie Sanders. It isn't used by Donald Trump. So that remains in the background. And of course, as a leftist, I want that to be in the foreground. But I also want to sort of unpack the cultural, liberal, conservative, racial aspects of the rhetoric that we're hearing and of the strategizing that we're hearing. I think ultimately the question on the table is, should people vote for the lesser evil in terms of Hillary Clinton? And there's a lot of debate about that on the left right now, strangely putting Noam Chomsky in the crosshairs of quite a few people. So, and maybe even me. But in any event, let me start by pointing out 2 books. One which I've mentioned in the past, Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank. The book Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank is a recent book. It's directed at liberals and the left from a critical point of view towards what Frank calls the professional class. That is the class that Hillary Clinton clearly represents and that supports neoliberal policies and that has basically taken over the Democratic Party, the professional class taking over the Democratic Party from with still dependent on votes from unionists, still dependent on votes from blacks and most minorities and poor people, but centered on the professional class. Another book that I came across in the library, in the new bookshelf, brought my copy in just to have a little show and tell, by a good journalist and historian named Steve Fraser, called The Limousine Liberal. Like Listen Liberal, this book, of course, is not really directed at the right. It's not really directed at conservatives. It's about conservatives. Perhaps some conservatives might want to read this and think about themselves, but he traces the concept of limousine liberal, the subtext, how an incendiary image united the right and fractured America. That's not quite right exactly, but I'll leave it for now. He's talking about right-wing populism. He's tracing right-wing populism from early in the last century all the way through the McCarthy era up till the time when the word limousine liberal the phrase was coined in relation to the election of John Lindsay to mayor of New York City in 1965, and then from there forward all the way to some of the rhetoric of Donald Trump. He doesn't really talk about Trump so much. This book, I think, is a few months old, so therefore doesn't really address Trump's success in this electoral process, but it's obviously relevant and sort of prescient in that sense. So we have right-wing populism on the one hand and left-wing professional classism, according to Thomas Frank, on the other hand. And this is the cultural rhetoric with cultural discourse that we're dealing with now and trying from, in my perspective, from the left, from a more of a class-based perspective, trying to sort out how all these cultural things are playing themselves out. Obviously more about how they're obscuring rather than enlightening us about the kind of issues that you just put on the table in relation to Brexit. And I think relevant to that, I'm going to read a couple quotes just from websites that were posted this morning. The first is from ZNet, and the second is from Counterpunch. And I'll just read these, maybe a little out of context, but I think you'll get the idea of where I'm going with this. Michael Albert, the proprietor of the ZNet website and one of the founders of the participatory economics movement and somebody who's really helped introduce Noam Chomsky more popularly in this country, wrote the following in the context of his work. He writes, "The passionate anger at elites coursing through a good part of Trump's supporters," and I bet this holds true in the UK, Spain, France, Austria, in Poland too, is in fact class-conscious hostility to a perceived class enemy. The thing is, the hated enemy is not just, or perhaps even mainly, capitalists. Most working people have never encountered a capitalist, not once, but they routinely encounter doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, and others who have highly empowering jobs and major associated status and wealth. Here he's talking about what Thomas Frank calls the professional class, and he's talking about people who support Trump who despise this class and in some ways rightfully do so. And Albert goes on, these empowered folk compose what I call the coordinator class. This is another name for the professional class. About 20% of the population. Workers daily serve these people, obey these people, get meager but absolutely essential benefits from these people, often paternalistically. Workers are routinely treated like children or worse by these people. And yes, when we are talking about overall averaged out attitudes, workers even despise these people. Trump's supporters support him, even love him, because all of the faults that his critics point to, rather than despite those faults. They believe Trump is a good guy, friendly, and mainly unrelentingly honest. He doesn't masquerade. He isn't a lying hypocrite. He doesn't exude academic arrogance. He shoots straight, tough, reliable, ready to fight. He is not some hypocritical, arrogant, dismissive academic coordinator class type like Clinton, who will pander to workers, talk about workers, claim to support workers, but who can viscerally feel really just who they can viscerally feel just doesn't give a damn about working people and is so classist, yes, classist, that it is palpable in the way she walks, in the way she talks, in the very air that circulates around her. All of it is so different than Trump's walk, talk, and surrounding air. So what Michael Albert is doing here is trying to illuminate us about what it is that the people who support Trump see in Trump from a class-based perspective, not just from a cultural perspective, leaving the racism aside, leaving the bigotry aside, to shine the light of class conflict, which populism, I mean, we certainly are talking about right-wing populism with Donald Trump, but the origins of populism were certainly in the class-based nature of American society in the late 1800s, and certainly there is a class-based aspect to Donald Trump's support, given that they do not identify with the class of people that represent the Democratic Party, that is the professional class. And this critique comes from a guy on Counterpunch, comes from a guy named Rob Ure, U-R-I-E, who writes regularly there and is a political economist, but I think writes astutely about race and culture in this context. Just to break down some of the barriers in terms of how we assume that we talk about race in relation to Clinton and Trump, that Clinton is not a racist, whereas Trump is a racist. And what Ure writes in these two paragraphs is, when Donald Trump rails against criminal Mexican immigrants, he combines the circumstances created by Bill Clinton's free trade, quote unquote, policies with assertions made repeatedly by Barack Obama and his lieutenants that the 2 million people they arrested and deported for immigration violations were, quote unquote, criminals. And in what way, Ure asks, other than degree of explicitness, is Mr. Trump's use of dog whistle politics different from that of the Clintons? Part of the problem is that under U.S. law, immigration law violators are criminals, quote unquote. The claim is tautological. Given the background circumstances of international dispossession engineered by Bill Clinton for the benefit of U.S. agribusiness and American industrialists looking for cheap labor, who bears responsibility, Ure asks, for the dispossession that led to the crimes, quote unquote, committed? Put differently, why is the crime not the act of dispossession rather than the acts of the dispossessed? The implied assertion that Donald Trump rallies real, quote unquote, racists and nativists amongst dispossessed white working class voters, while Bill and Hillary Clinton rally real racism, but not real racists amongst the liberal classes, adds the missing class dimension to the political argument in support of Mrs. Clinton. In what way are the upper middle class swing, quote unquote, voters to whom the Clintons appealed with coded racial politics not racists in the same manner as Donald Trump's voters? Perhaps Mrs. Clinton would care to explain the difference to the several million black human beings whose lives were destroyed by the American system of mass incarceration. Having been warned of likely dislocations from the trade agreements they passed, why shouldn't establishment Democrats be held to account for the social consequences of their policies? So that's an end of the segment from Rob Ure on today's Counterpunch website. And so, again, I would just reiterate that what I'm trying to relate here, what I'm trying to shine some light on, is the discourse, the kind of assumed discourse about class and race and culture, about what we call liberals and conservatives, right and left, Republicans and Democrats, and look at that from a somewhat broader point of view to understand the racism inherent in both aspects of corporate politics in this country, which you could if you can call Donald Trump a right-wing populist, perhaps you can call Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton certainly a kind of left-wing populist in the manner that he really sort of assumes that he has the votes of minority and many poor people in this country, simply on the basis of his identity as a Democrat rather than a Republican. So these are the issues that we need to be considering. These are the very, I think, hard-hitting issues and honest issues that we need to be considering as we decide, to get back to my opening point, as to what kind of strategic voting, if any, we're going to be doing this fall, how and where and why we're going to support third-party candidates, libertarian candidates, Green Party candidates, as an alternative to this very confined neoliberal discourse that we're going to be hearing for the next 4 months.
Thank you, David. You are watching News from Neptune, and we'll go to Ron Zook for some comments.
Here we are again. The Three Stooges, or
Garrulous old man.
more recently, the Three Amigos, I guess that people are talking about.
Ron, I should contrast to your money bags. I should contrast my empty wallet.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. One of us
I'm
has
not
done
gonna-
very well
I'm
here.
not going to put it on the table, but
Okay.
there it is.
Okay. Yeah, I read something this morning about the Brexit diet in England. The Brits are losing lots of pounds, but oh, gross. Okay.
And that before breakfast. Huh?
Right. Brexit. 100 pundits with contradictory opinions have been telling us what it all means.
I thought I did that.
Yeah. Right. Well, some people have contrary theories.
Really?
Yeah, Ron Paul says the end is near. The Brexit means the dissolution of the European Union and the collapse of global capitalism. So
We can only
stock
hope,
up
huh?
on gold is his constant advice. Why did the Brexit vote go the way it did? The going theories in the media are racism, xenophobia, economic precarity of a large part of the population because of resentment of the austerity that's been imposed in some places by the European Union. So in part, it's being called a nativist reaction to the refugees and migrants taking jobs and flooding the welfare system and so on. And indeed, in the media now, there are more and more stories of very ugly attacks on people who look foreign and like they might be refugees in England, and to what extent that is a major phenomenon worth paying attention to, I'm not sure. In this country, both parties seem to be splitting, as they are in England, apparently. The one that's under discussion here today, I guess, is the split between the old-fashioned kind of social democrats, the Democrats of the 30s and 40s and so on, versus the limousine liberals, or what I call the big buck Democrats. And where will this come out? Will there be a realignment of parties? It is unclear to me. There seems to be a lot of chaos and disruption in the whole electoral system, and I wish I had a clear guidance on what's happening there.
I would argue that the chaos and disruption is neoliberalism itself.
Well, yeah. There are more and more items starting to appear. The anti-Hillary stuff is becoming very prominent. There's a book promising to tell us about Hillary's dark secrets, and
I want to read that book.
yeah,
As long
Saying that this
as long as I'm not in it.
yeah, right. The saying that the apocalypse is upon us, the ultimate battle between good and evil. Hillary, of course, being evil, and this stuff is, I guess, mildly amusing to me. But anyway, do we have anything to learn from it? I'm not sure. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal in April by Kenneth Rogoff, professor of economics at Harvard.
Yes.
The anti-trade rhetoric by Trump and Sanders could doom millions to poverty.
Particularly if they work for Goldman Sachs. Yes.
Right. The rise of anti-trade populism in the U.S. election campaign portends a dangerous retreat from the United States' role in world affairs.
Right.
In the name of reducing U.S. inequality, presidential candidates in both parties would stymie the aspirations of hundreds of millions of desperately poor people in the developing world to join the middle class. If the political appeal of anti-trade policies proves durable, it will mark a historic turning point in global economic affairs, one that bodes ill for the future of American leadership. So there are a couple of competing themes here. I think one is American leadership, the other is inequality, and what should be done to advance one and reduce the other is interesting. Try to disentangle that. Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders is far more appealing than the Donald, but his anti-trade rhetoric is almost as dangerous. Following prominent left-leaning economists, Sanders rails against the proposed new Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, even though it would do much to help the developing world. For example, by opening up Japan's market to Latin American imports, and so on. So where's he getting this stuff? I'm amazed.
He's getting it from the best economic minds that, that our Ivy League universities have to offer.
Yeah. The agreement that forced Mexico to lower its tariffs on the U.S. goods far more than it forced the U.S. to reduce its already low tariffs on Mexican goods. Unfortunately, the resounding success of Sanders and Trump's anti-trade rhetoric has pulled Clinton away from her more centrist position and might have the same effect on many members of the House and Senate. This is a recipe for disaster, he says. What? Okay.
You have to be highly educated to believe stuff like that.
Yeah, right.
Noam Chomsky says. Yeah.
A couple of other points I want to touch upon. The unease, the miasma emanating from Wall Street. More and more people are, I think, becoming dubious about and questioning orthodox economic doctrine as taught in what's called Econ 101 or MBA economics. And a number of protests are arising around the country. The standard orthodox economics was always taught to us as a scientific system. The principal validation for it, although it had little or no empirical basis, was the self-evident truth of Adam Smith's invisible hands, supposedly, which was reconciling all lesser interests of individuals, each pursuing his own individual interest or greedy tendencies. And those would somehow all contribute to the general welfare of society and make the whole thing better than it would be otherwise if they were trying to follow some rules laid down by the government. So this seems to me an extremely weird idea. How it ever acquired such a following and such plausibility to people it really amazes me.
You mean the invisible hand doctrine as it's usually set out?
Yeah. And this is a curious bit of superstition, but asked to support it, the economists will say, well, of course, it makes assumptions that are false. All of their work makes assumptions that are, by and large, false. But it's such a neat and tidy system, enabling us to write down lots of equations and draw lots of pretty graphs and so on. We need it. We have to have it. And what would you have in its place? The unease here has become considerable, I think, even among some professional economists who have had standard training. And there's a series of postings on Facebook recently about well, it's not a doctrine exactly, a theme called evonomics, evolutionary economics, which kind of is giving substance to a interesting thesis I read about a number of years ago. Orthodox economics, as set forth by Adam Smith and Malthus and Ricardo, and even to some extent Marx, apparently, who followed Ricardo in a number of respects, made kind of Newtonian assumptions about there being underlying definite laws of motion about capitalism and the economic system generally, and so on. And more and more of these people, the economics people, are saying it's not like that at all. The Newtonian paradigm is wrong, and we need to switch to what they would call a more Darwinian paradigm, emphasizing the evolution of the economic system. It doesn't provide you with any predictions about what's going to happen, but it does, to some extent, inform you about what has happened in the past. That's why it's more congenial to what in the past has been called institutional economics or historical economics, as set forth by Veblen, rather than the other worthies that I mentioned. So I suggest that you take a look at that if you're curious. It's on Facebook, or you can Google evonomics, EVO-nomics, and see what you think of that. It seems to me there's a lot of wisdom in what they're saying, and the supposed superiority of the orthodox economics will no longer be quite so obvious to you, I think, after you've read that.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching News from Neptune. We should point out that Ron and David and I spent some time this winter reading Thomas Piketty's important book, Capital in the 21st Century. And Piketty begins with a contempt for professional academic economists, at least as deep as Ron's. So this is a popular debate that's going on right now, and it shows up the fact that a lot of what has passed for academic and indeed scientific and mathematical economics has been special pleading for the ascendancy of post-World War II capitalism, particularly at the institution that Noam Chomsky once called the Academy for the Passive and Obedient, that is Harvard University. And Harvard University economists, such as the one that Ron was quoting, are good examples, it seems to me, of this ideological construct. I think it's worth mentioning, at least, that Chomsky himself argues that the account of the invisible hand, which is the one thing everyone knows about Adam Smith, isn't found in Adam Smith. That is, although the words appear there, Smith uses, we're talking about Adam Smith's influential book, The Wealth of Nations, that appeared in 1776. Smith does use the phrase, but he doesn't turn it into the theory of a sort of objective correlation of economic interests that it has become in standard economic parlance. It's not there because Smith didn't believe it. Smith was a moral writer more than anything else, interested in how people should behave, not interested in an attempt to argue for an abstract description of what must be the case. He is, in that sense, a pre-modern economist, and that's a good thing too, probably.
Yeah. Can I just
sure.
interject about?
Yeah.
I mean, what it's interesting. It's not only amazing what people have made out of the notion of the invisible hand in terms of just a simplistic understanding, like if everybody pursues their own selfish interests, everything will work out for everyone. Because the smarter people will do better, but some of their smartness will trickle down in the form of progress to the working classes. But it's also amazing that even this notion of the invisible hand is even identified, as you say, with Adam Smith, because when he uses, if I understand correctly, and you can raise up a PDF copy of the Wealth of Nations and do a find for invisible hand, and what you will find is that the invisible hand refers to trade relations among nations. The fact that, and it doesn't refer to free trade, it refers to the fact that the leaders of a nation will tend to favor the people of that nation in their trade policies with other nations in specific terms, that they won't put their own workers out of work just to make a few dollars by buying something cheaper from another country. That the invisible hand, that their moral goodness will encourage, like an invisible hand, for them to favor their own nation. This is in a book called The Wealth of Nations, not the wealth of the upper classes, not the wealth of the capitalist or mercantile class. So that's just one of the many, as we clear away all of the ideological nonsense that Ron refers to and that you commented on, that we're left with a profession, an economics profession in this country with a couple of outposts of fairly sensible leftist, Keynesian, Marxist, heterodox modern monetary theory. One is at UMass Amherst, where you'll find the Political Economy Research Institute, and a guy named Friedman, who I think. There's a couple of Friedmans.
That's right.
Several Friedman.
Not Thomas Friedman. But and then you also you'll also find at University of Missouri, Kansas City, of all places, because it's the only place that apparently they were able to just sort of get some jobs and then invite other people to have jobs, people who talk about modern monetary theory, people like Michael Hunson, people like Bill Black, who one sees in the liberal to left media critiquing what's going on Wall Street, what's going on with debt, trying to understand the role of debt and so forth, which is absolutely crucial, understanding the role of private debt, not public debt, but private debt in bringing down our economy in 2008 and probably again in sometime in the near or perhaps not so near future.
Comment, Ron?
Well, yeah, I've been reading some interesting stuff about what a supposed free market economy or capitalism or neoliberalism does to people, and trying to grow up with that ideology surrounding you, part of what I call the miasma from Wall Street. How learning economics makes you antisocial. Some interesting psychological research has begun to appear about what they call the corrupting effects of economic studies and their pretensions to science. Question, does orthodox MBA economics make people greedy? It's difficult to establish that, because people who are already greedy, I think, in many respects, tend to study it. Indeed, this has been researched to some extent by psychologists, And they found that economics students tend to be noticeably, significantly more self-centered and greedy than other people. So are economics majors and MBA students already self-selected by their inclinations to the self-serving greed and grab ideology of late-stage capitalism, sometimes called neoliberalism? Well, again, this has led a number of people to become somewhat disillusioned with orthodox economics, I think. And I'm reading more and more references to economic man versus behavioral, evolutionary, and institutional economics. And more problems people are having with the supposed Darwinian thesis of the survival of the fittest. I've talked to people who are convinced that socialism can't work because it violates the basic laws of economics. They think that there are laws of economics, apparently in the same sense that there are laws of physics or mechanics, as in Newtonianism. But this seems to me kind of weird and mistaken. If there are any basic laws of economics in the same sense that there are laws of physics, then you can't violate them.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. How can you violate the laws of physics?
Right.
How can you violate the laws of
If you think
economics?
Gravity is not just a good idea, it's the law.
And if you think you've done that, you've violated the law of physics, you just have a mistaken idea of what the law is.
Probably hit the ground pretty hard.
How you violate the laws of physics by jumping up and not falling down.
Right. Well, maybe a miracle will occur.
Marx made very clear at some fundamental level what the it's controversial. It's complex. It's not particularly controversial in my mind. Capitalism is a system for creating commodities that is full of contradictions. David Harvey, the very good Marxist economist or Marxist anthropologist, has a book called The 17 Contradictions of Capitalism. And I think that explains very well what it is we're in. It's not a matter of scientific laws so much as a matter. This is how commodity production works. What he calls instead of the commodity, money, commodity, the CMC, he talks about MCM, money, commodity, money. That's what industrial capitalism is. Money, making commodities to make more money. People need to understand these, I don't want to call them laws, they're just basic principles for understanding how the world works and how to understand it well enough as to move beyond that world, to recognize that's what's going on. We're always going to need money. We're always going to need finance to a certain extent. The mythology, I think, fundamentally comes around the fact that in capitalism, we're told that the producers, the entrepreneurs, the job creators are the basis of the economy. They're the basis for our productive system. We believe that everything else is built on that the taxes that come from that support government. But what we don't understand is that it's the people who produce the stuff, and the government can just as easily organize people to produce stuff. It creates the money to do that. It organizes the labor to do that. The private sector isn't the basis for the economy any more than any individual people are. We have a system, and that system can actually be governed by the people, not by the entrepreneurial class.
Well, we're talking about the relatively abstract discussion of economics, both in connection with the Brexit vote in Britain and the presidential race in this country. It is worthwhile to realize that the terms keep moving around on us. For example, the word neoliberalism, which I think in fact is a very helpful term because it allows us to see how things have changed recently. Ron suggested a moment ago that neoliberalism is just a sort of modern name for capitalism, if I understood you correctly. That's essentially true, but what it ignores, I think, is the fact that neoliberalism is a conscious political and economic strategy as a set of policies is in fact just that, a conscious, calculated construction that arose fairly recently, in the 1970s, by American business interests who were actually scared to death by the 60s, as we said, by the rise of democracy in the context of the Vietnam War and so forth in this country, and very dangerous things in the eyes of American businessmen that were being said by Americans in the early 70s about the need for democratizing the economy. The famous text in this regard was a book put out by three academics, I think at least two of them from Harvard, under the auspices of the Trilateral Commission, called The Crisis of Democracy. The crisis of democracy in the minds of these businessmen and economists was that there was too much democracy around. People are getting too excited about democracy. We have to put the lid on it in some case. We certainly can't have the economy run democratically. The economy run democratically, of course, is a good working definition of socialism, but we hadn't even got to that point of the argument. In the 70s, the businessmen were just realizing that this democracy talk was dangerous to their interests, that is, to the profits of what we came to call the 1%. But the 1% were there first. They got together and established a set of policies that included such things as the destruction of labor unions, the establishment of trade pacts like NAFTA and Trans-Pacific Partnership and so forth, the removal of the social supports that had proved necessary after the Great Depression, like Social Security and Medicare, things of this sort, the ratcheting down of these programs because we, quote, we can't afford them, close quote, and the establishment of what came to be called in Europe austerity. That is, the government stopped doing things, stopped spending money on things that actually helped people. And of course, we did the same thing in this country in recent presidential administrations. We've avoided the word for the most part, but the policy has been there very much so, including the current in the current administration. Now, in this sense, neoliberalism describes the policies of both parties in this country and both parties in Britain. It's worthwhile looking at what's going on in Britain now because there's sort of a distorting mirror effect. Some things look bigger, some things look smaller, so to speak. But in fact, it is a reflection of the class the class struggle that is going on in both countries. And it very much is a class struggle, even though one of the techniques of neoliberalism from the 1970s was to pretend to everyone there was no such thing as a class struggle, and that if we want to do left politics, we do left politics in terms of identity, in terms of racial or gender identities and so forth. We don't do it in terms of class identities because, in fact, we're all in it together. It's all just one class. Some people are richer and poorer than others, but it really doesn't make any difference. And therefore, what we have to do is make sure that everybody gets included, which means that blacks and women and everyone else has a fair chance at this good and competitive economy.
Giving rise to what I would call the victim culture.
Yeah, the folks who aren't included being the victims.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Women, blacks, Jews, Hispanics, American Indians, they're all victims.
But it's important to see that that's a stopgap, that is an attempt to avoid the questions that underlay politics from the Depression on, and that is the relationship between classes. Classes that are not a matter of how you think of yourself or how other people think of you, they're matters of the objective role that you actually play in the economy, how you make your daily bread. This is the issue that had to be set aside by neoliberalism in favor of, if you like, a victim politics or an identity politics that says, of course, there's nothing really wrong with our society except that some people are excluded, and we got to make sure that they get back in one way or another.
Well, you think that neoliberalism is a policy? I think many people say it's merely a slogan, and there's a big step
Oh no, it's certainly as I say, it's a set of
policies.
conscious policies set out from in the 70s by American business who said, look, we have got to get the government, we have got to get the legal structure to undergird the profits of the rich. And for example, by making union demands less possible, by removing social supports like Social Security, by establishing international, globalized regimes that support the profits of the owners rather than the rights of the workers in foreign countries. The move to globalization, parallel to the move to financialization, were part of the policies of neoliberalism. I think the point is that it was a conscious set of policies on the part of the people who were advocating it, on the part of the American business elite that was pushing for it. The people who didn't realize that it was a conscious set of policies was the 99%, the rest of us who were the victims of it.
I've really been thinking about that recently. It's like, how do we know what is hitting us when it's hitting us? It's very hard to know.
Well,
there was a report just released this past week as to how the whole student loan industry became privatized in the 1980s or so. What started out as a public and relatively reasonable way of offering low interest loans to college students became an incredibly profitable way and a way of transferring wealth from the 99% to the 1%. This report was by a guy named James Steele, who's well known for his work on sort of the Reagan era policies of deindustrialization and so forth in the 1980s. But in any event, the policies, it isn't like you can go exactly somewhere and see what the plan was, but there's a consistency.
Pretty close.
It's the financialization of so much of our economy. How did we start using credit cards? How did that happen? How did the mortgage thing happen? Not just basic mortgages, but the whole securitization of mortgages. How did the pension thing happen? How did it happen that the IRA thing that we're supposed to give up on defined benefit pensions and save money in our own IRA? I mean, we were told all this stuff came at ordinary people so fast, and it says, well, this is progress. This is the way things are going, and you have to be smart. I can't claim I understood what was going on in the 1990s when, at that point in life, I was putting some money in the stock market and hoping this and that and the other thing. I could see all that everybody was just sucked into that because they had to be. Because we're all told we have to create wealth in order to retire, we were told we have to create our own wealth, and that was the only way of doing it. Social Security wasn't going to be enough. The society wasn't going to be able to afford to support us. Somehow we were getting poorer while we were getting richer, and so if you were privileged enough, you could protect yourself from that. But that privileged class seems to be getting smaller and smaller. People thought, well, that's 2/3 of it, that's 3/4 of it. No, it turns out it's 1/3 of us, 20% of it. No, it's really only like 5% of us who can really who could really accumulate the wealth to have a decent life after they retire. Maybe it's 20%, but that isn't enough, obviously. We're a much richer country than we were 40 years ago when all this started. It wasn't explicitly planned, but it was part of a way of looking at the world. This is what, Carl, you are referring to, what we refer to as this neoliberal approach.
Yeah, another important component, I think, of this ideology or movement or whatever it is of course, deregulation and privatization.
Right. Exactly.
And free
privatization
trade.
of the schools,
What's
of the
called
prisons.
free trade.
Yeah, these are essentially semi-socialist institutions. Public education, and the idea that they should be privatized, of course, is directly bound up with the neoliberal account of society. A lot of the problem I think people have with the term neoliberalism, which was introduced by folks who could see what was going on, but was not a sort of popular political term in our everyday discourse. A lot of the problem is that the word liberal has moved around so much in the last 3 centuries, really, that you have to specify which form of liberal you're talking about. Yeah. It's worthwhile here, by the way, to remember your schoolboy Latin, and that the word liberal comes from the word meaning free. But the question of any liberalism is what it is it wants to free you from. When liberalism first appears in the political discourse of Europe in the 17th century and into the 18th century, liberalism means freeing people from absolutist church and state. The democratic revolutions, including the French Revolution most notably, but perhaps in some sense as well the American War of Independence, were liberal revolutions, or at least were seen as that in some cases, because they were seen as freeing people from other things. Now, once the term of liberal equated with freeing was available for use, it became in the 19th century a notion of freeing economic activity from the control of government. Manchester liberalism, as it was called in the heroic days of capitalism in England, meant freeing the business activities in Britain from any control of the government. Now, that's closer to what we mean when we speak of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, new liberalism, is a new form of that 19th century liberalism that means to free up business. What's new about neoliberalism is it wants to use the government to do it. And therefore you get the suppression of popular supports, you get the breakup of unions, you get the sorts of things that neoliberalism is calling on to free up capital, money, to make more money.
On the one hand, as Panish and Gindin, as I constantly refer to on this program, are trying to understand the state in terms of the way neoliberals have used the state to affect their programs.
Yes.
But it also should be noted that one meaning of the word freeing up, or freeing in terms of liberal and neoliberal, meaning that business would be freed from the burdens of the welfare state.
Exactly.
And that became identified with liberalism, especially with the Democratic Party and the Labour Party in Britain after World War II. So now they're freed up. They need the state. They need the military force that the state brings to offer. They need the financial bailouts. They need all kinds of things from the state. But what they don't need from the state is the welfare state. They don't need a state that actually helps people. And one thing that makes our job so difficult overall is that we just don't get any help in the mainstream media in terms of defining these terms.
For me, this harks back to the old debates about positive and negative freedom, freedom to versus freedom from, and some have attacked that as being inept also, but it's interesting. Am I free to go on a vacation around the world and so on? Well, there's no law against it, but I don't have the money to do it. So am I free to do it? In what sense?
Well, I mean, I would say just freedom in terms of basic rights to have food, clothing, and shelter, and a few other things as the basis for freedom to.
Yeah.
And freedom from has its place, obviously, but that isn't what our government's about. They're spying on us all the time.
The attention, though, to what the words mean is extremely important. I mean, we live in a society which is perhaps the most propagandized society in human history, and precisely because the sorts of control available to dictatorships of the 20th century and so forth aren't really available to our rulers today. Therefore, they have to find a better way to keep the population in control. And one of the best ways to do it is to control what that population thinks. And if you can control the meaning of language, if you control the meaning of words, then the thinking, as it were, can take care of itself. So it is a revolutionary act for us to define our terms, to try to say what we're talking about, and to try to say what we mean on the basis of a shared understanding of what those terms mean. I tend to think these days that it is worthwhile to introduce the terms neoliberal and neoconservative into our political discussion because they have changed within living memory, and the change is worthwhile. It's worthwhile to recognize the change. To use neoliberal to mean using the government to benefit a business elite seems to me to be a basic definition. To use neoconservative to mean using the military to benefit the business elite also seems to me to work. But it isn't easy. We'll talk about this more in the future. I think we're out now. Yeah. You've been watching news from Neptune for the. You have a quick response to that, Ron? Did you?
No. Just a couple of other points. I wanted to say something about the passing of Gene Vanderpoort.
Please do.
But
we should, and we have a minute left. We'll talk about that on the Tuesday show and again here next week.
Yeah.
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 26th week of 2016, a trumping Brexit edition. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Zoke and David Green. Our thanks to our directors and producer Jason and Joseph. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.